Well, we welcome everybody to our follow-up discussion of the NIST documentation that we're all working on. We know we may have a few others that are joining us, but again, like last time, we're going to record the program and we'll post it to our YouTube page and share the link with everyone in case you need to share it with any staff or anyone else on your team, or if there's anyone that we missed today. And so we're happy everyone could set aside a little time. We're going to move quickly again today. We'll do a brief review, but we'll get into some of what would be the next steps for us all to work on. We know some were able to join us back over the summer, but then with the pandemic and everybody adjusting how they were going to open school, we understood that attention was taken away from this. And now we want to move our attention back to following up on our documentation so that we're making progress with it collectively. So what I'll do is share my screen. We'll work through a little bit of a presentation just to review and then get right into our two documents, that being the Wisp and the CSOP documents that hopefully each of you have a copy of. If you don't, and it's something that maybe your site did not procure over the summer, afterwards you can reach out to us and we can let you know how to obtain the templates so that we can work on them together. But we'll review a set on screen just so we can get into what's involved and again what our next steps are going to be. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going. And throughout the discussion, if you have any questions, just use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and then we'll stop for a moment, discuss those questions, and then move along. But we'll get right into it now. So as we said, our objectives today are just to review a little bit of what we went over last time. When we met over the summer or early in the summer, we, in a broad view, discussed what's involved in the NIST framework. And then we dug into a little bit of the documentation that we've been starting to use, the templates that we received from Compliance Forge, and how they're laid out and how we might start to address them and customize them for each of our sites. So we're just going to review those documents briefly. And then we're going to really focus on what the next steps need to be in outlining the next few months of activities that we want to be involved in. So we'll start by just a brief view of that documentation. This little pyramid structure here really outlines everything that's involved in documenting the NIST framework and how thorough you want to get with that documentation. When we talk about the documents that we already have, we're talking about the Wisp document, which is the Written Internet Security Program, which is sort of a high-level document that outlines the core policies that are necessary to live up to the NIST framework. Okay? So when we go beyond just those policies, we get into the actual procedures that are involved for living up to those policies. And ultimately, that's where a lot of the work that we're going to need to do will be accomplished. So as we get further along, we will get into those specific areas that we need to customize for each site and go from there. So let's start with a brief review of this Wisp document. And hopefully it's legible for everyone on the screen here. As you look across this document, maybe you have your own copy of it, or if this is your first time looking at it, this is a high-level document that outlines a number of policies that ultimately live up to the NIST cybersecurity framework. And as we discussed in the past, there are a number of frameworks that a school district or an entity can subscribe to and put forth as their security program. The cybersecurity framework from NIST is actually one of the more introductory levels of cybersecurity frameworks. So ultimately, it's sort of a beginning point. And we may find that in due time, more is asked of school districts, but at least this is a foundation that we can build on. As we examine those policies, if we just look at the table of contents, there's a review section to this document, and then it gets right into each of these components. Security and privacy governance, asset management, our continuity and disaster recovery plans, capacity planning. Each one of these involves a subset of a handful of policies that are what uphold the NIST framework. Now, I use that term policy, and it's something that came up in our last discussion, and frankly, it's still sort of an open item that we're going to encourage you to look into. And that's whether or not this document gets adopted by your board as a district policy. We know that the Ed Law 2D policy that you put in place over the summer, that was a district policy. But there's a chance, because we're using that term policy, that this too may be something that needs to be adopted. In fact, there's references throughout this document to reviewing it with your executive administration, your executive team. So it at least is something that needs to be accepted or reviewed or acknowledged by the superintendent, your administrative staff, and potentially even the legal counsel for the district, something that maybe they review on an annual basis to ensure that it is acceptable and that it is the formal process and set of policies in place for the district when it comes to IT. So it's just something to keep in mind, and it's part of the homework that we're going to ask you to look into doing is maybe even getting some insight from your superintendent, their feedback, as well as potentially even the school's legal counsel to see how best to handle this set of documentation. It may ultimately mean changing the vernacular to use a different term other than policy, but for now we're going to refer to these as policies because they align with the NIST framework. What I'm going to do in this document is actually scroll all the way to the bottom, because most of this document is written for you. In fact, there's very little in this document that needs to be customized for a district. Maybe at most, if we review some of the acronyms, if you already have teams in place for different things, maybe that's changed. But for the most part, it can stay static the way it is. But if we get towards the bottom, in Appendix A, this is the summary of all of the actual policies that are listed throughout the document. So we mentioned last time that this is a little bit of a cheat sheet for the NIST framework because it lays out each individual policy that you would need to review and adopt, at least as an IT department within the district. So we see something like our business continuity and disaster recovery policy. Now, this document is written for EduTech directly, so you'll see it uses ET for EduTech. For your site, it will use the acronym for the district. But in our case, the policy is that ET shall establish and manage the capability for maintaining the continuity of operation to ensure the availability of critical technology resources during adverse conditions. These are standard policy statements that are made. So that's why this document requires very little in the way of changes. It's sort of dictated by the NIST framework that you have to have these components. So they're listed for us here. Really what needs to be done is a review of these policies with the entire IT team. And that's going to be on our homework at the end of this, is a recommendation that you go through this document on a high level with your entire IT team, from your data individuals to your on-site, IT staff, your privacy and data individuals that may be involved in that piece of it, depending on how large your team is. This is something that we recommend doing on at least an annual basis, is a review of this document. Upon reviewing it, there is a section that can be updated and signed off on, something you can sign off on, referencing any changes or adjustments that are made. And so this is a piece that needs to be maintained as well. We also recommend having a second page, maybe another page at the end of this, that's sort of a sign-in sheet for that meeting. So you have some log of the fact that this was reviewed by the team, at least on an annual basis. So that's something to keep in mind. And at the end of our discussion, we'll actually share out some to-do items, and that's going to be number one on the list. It does not have to be a day-long session. It could be just an hour or so. If you share the document out with your team ahead of time, which you should, it's something that you could sit down and maybe an hour, review the items, and ensure that everybody has a clear understanding of them. So as we scroll through these items, again, they're very straightforward statements, but what they lack is a procedure that defines how we live up to those policies. And that's where we get into our secondary document. So again, our Wisp document outlines all of the policies and the intent of those policies that the district has when it comes to living up to this NIST cybersecurity framework. This document really formulates the beginning of our security program, if we think of it that way, our digital security program, which we'll reference later. Ultimately, this digital security program is going to encompass a number of documents and items and lists and inventories that really all get collected together, either into a physical binder or a shared folder somewhere on your network. But ultimately, altogether, they are going to form your digital security program, which is something that's a requirement in this NIST cybersecurity framework. This is the top level of that program, and it outlines really the intent and the policies associated with it. So as long as the name of the district is correct, or the entity, in our case, EduTech, as long as the acronyms throughout it are correct, and as long as you are reviewing it and you have an understanding of it and you are adopting it, at least as a team, this document is complete and can get put on the shelf, and it's reviewed either annually or more frequently. So this is a very easy document to maintain and keep up to date. Now we're going to get into the work. And that's when we get into the procedures associated with much of these or many of these policies. And that's when we get into our review of the CSOP, which is this other document. The Cybersecurity Standardized Operating Procedures. In our case, it's just the SOP. In your case, it may say CSOP, but it's basically the same thing. You notice that this document is written based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. That means that throughout the document, you'll see footnotes that cross-reference various NIST framework requirements, as well as references to other frameworks as well, like ISO and a few other frameworks that exist. There's a lot of overlap between these frameworks. So you'll see cross-references at the bottom. There's even an Excel spreadsheet that gives you a full list, which is helpful if there's ever an audit and there's a question about whether or not we're covering a certain component. The document has those cross-references already in there. So let's get right into this document and start to review a little bit of what work needs to be accomplished with it. First thing we're going to look at is this section overview, instructions, and examples. The reason why we're going to review it is because ultimately it's a section of the document that will get removed. It's not something you want to throw away, but it's not something that's going to be part of the permanent document, because it's really instructions for us in how to customize this document. So it talks about the terminology involved, guidance on how to customize it, what needs to be changed. Maybe we have established teams already for different aspects of our security program, and that would mean changing some of the references and some of the acronyms that are used. But for the most part, since most school districts are starting from scratch with a lot of this, the majority of the document can stay fixed, but as we go through different sections, there are little spots where it can be altered or changed. But ultimately, this whole section will come out of your final document and just get put separately, because it's just instructions for how to customize it. As we scroll through, we get into a clear understanding, and this is something you take time to read, of how Compliance Forge, who put together these templates, how they formulate or how they write their policies and procedures so that you can maintain consistency throughout the document. So that's what this section is as well. I'm just going to scroll through a little bit. This section here can stay, and it's really just an outline of the fact that this document leverages the NIST cybersecurity framework. And I'm moving quickly through this, but as we work as individual teams at each site, we'll help you with all of this, what stays, what doesn't. But I want to give everyone today an overview of it. Now we get into an example of a policy or procedure, I apologize. You'll notice here, this first section is highlighted in yellow. And throughout this document, each procedure component has a section at the top highlighted in yellow. That section is not required, but gives you the framework for customizing it further in a way that gives you additional information that might be helpful down the road. So things like, who is the owner of this task? how often does it occur? What is the impact of it? Is there a specific performance target that we have associated with it? And then maybe what technology is in use. So maybe when it comes to our backups and procedures, this might be where we specify that it's a Barracuda backup or it's another component, or if there's different layers to our backup, what systems are used. So it can be used. It's not necessary to finalize this document, but it's helpful to have it in each section. It might be something that's just set as hidden in Microsoft Word, or maybe it's removed and used as needed. But just don't be overwhelmed by feeling like you have to fill out every piece of that section. It really depends on how granular we want to get. And in certain sections, maybe we do get more granular. Or over time, as we grow and mature in this program, certain sections will get built out. Now we're going to get to our first section that requires some actual work on our part to fill out. And this is also going to be listed on our homework, we'll call it, for our next meeting. But this section, cybersecurity, privacy, and function overview, what this reviews is, it's the first section that sort of outlines things that are custom to your site. So if there are specific teams, now imagine a Fortune 500 company or a Fortune 100 company might have multiple teams associated with their IT program, their cybersecurity program, whatever it may be. There may be teams regionally, throughout the globe. In your case, it's likely that you may have one team with, every member of your IT staff and some of your other HR staff may be part of that team. So don't feel like you have to create a team for each of these, but it may be that initially we're filling this out with our primary, cybersecurity team, which would be individuals like your network administrator, even your desktop support staff, your data management individuals, those that are your, whoever your cybersecurity or your data privacy officer, individuals like that would get listed here. You'll notice the next section is a mission statement, which is important because it's going to really help guide our teams and your teams at each site to understand the intent of why we have this document and why we've put it together. They give you some samples. Now, obviously, this is less critical to an audit, but it is important from the standpoint of coaching the team and ensuring that everyone understands why we're using this. So you'll see some of the samples, but this is something that needs to be updated and edited, filled out. Should not take very long to do it. There's a value proposition section. There's also a section on known compliance requirements. So this will likely be the same for each district. So as we develop this section together, we'll likely share what we're all putting in these sections. But obviously there's EdLaw 2D, there's HIPAA, there's a number of other ones that may apply. We want to make sure those are all listed out here so it's clear. Same thing with, so there's statutory, regulatory, and contractual requirements that are listed. The contractual ones may be a little less, with the exception of maybe your requirements that may be built into contracts with your teachers union might be a good example of that. Just going to adjust our setup here a little bit. Sorry about that. Very good. So as we go on, this section is part of the homework that's going to need to get filled out. So if you're making notes for yourself, I'll share it at the end, sort of the to-do list, but there's a couple of points here: determining what our compliance requirements are, setting up a mission statement and a value proposition, as well as outlining the team or teams that will be part of the process with this document. So it's just something to keep in mind. Now let's get into one of the examples, just so you have an idea as to how this document is written and what workload we have ahead of us, and what we can sort of come up with the best approach to attacking that workload. So one of the overarching, policies is this cybersecurity governance component. Now you'll notice that each of these aligns with a policy that exists in the Wisp document. So as I go here and I go to security and privacy governance, my first policy is this security, privacy, governance policy. There's a subcomponent of it called publishing security and privacy policies. If I go back to my procedures document now, you'll notice a corresponding title there. And then what's new is this procedure component. So again, the Wisp has the policy, overarching policy up here, the control objectives, the standards, and the guidelines. This other document includes now the controls, control objectives, and the actual procedure involved. So when it comes to something like cybersecurity governance and how we publish these, security and privacy policies, you'll notice it gives us some bullet points on what needs to happen. It also outlines how often we do this. This is an area where we'd have to customize it and determine that on at least an annual basis and then we schedule which quarter of the year, and so we would choose it, we are going to review this component and this procedure and everything associated with it. So throughout this document, you'll notice in the procedures that every so often you will come across something like this, and the language is very similar, and this becomes a calendar event that has to take place. Make this a little easier. Let's see what we get. So as I was saying, statements like this become calendar events. And we update it to say specifically what quarter we're going to do it in. So there may be multiple times a year where we try to knock out some of these tasks that are really just review tasks. So ultimately, it might be a meeting with the IT team. For other things, it might be a meeting with the administrative staff of the district because they're part of the executive management team. So something like cybersecurity governance would likely include the superintendent. There may be others that are included in that based on how the district wants to handle it. You'll notice here it talks about cyber legal advisor. So it may be that there are others that it pays to be part of this discussion. And of course, we're going to do it maybe once a year. Maybe it's something that happens in the summer or the winter. But it's something that becomes part of that calendar of events. What we're doing in the background is going through this document and creating spreadsheets of those events that will have to take place so that we can share it with everyone since it's universal. So some of the things that we want to make as easy as possible are going to be those things like creating a table of each event that has to happen over the year. Because that's something then that makes it a lot easier for you to schedule it out as opposed to everybody having to go through and make that list. So we're going to try to simplify some of those tasks for everybody since that applies across the board. What we're going to do now is just scroll down to another section as an example of another task that's going to be involved. So if I get to, bear with me one second. Let's see. Okay. Use this example of asset inventories. So if we go back to our Wisp and we scroll down to the asset section, we see our policy that we shall protect its assets and data by implementing and maintaining appropriate IT asset management business practices across our enterprise. So what does that mean? We're going to have inventories and we're going to have processes associated with those inventories. If we go to our procedures now, there's reference made to these inventories. So this now starts a new list of things that we're going to collect. And that is secondary documents or secondary sets of data that we need to collect in order to complete our whole program that we're putting together. So asset inventories are one of them. Another one associated with the asset policy is network diagrams. So that's something that the IT team will put together. A lot of these we have in varying forms. So it's more just a collecting it all into one place process as we go through kind of the first brush of this. But ultimately, we're going to need to put those secondary documents together as part of this. At the same time, we're going to have to look at those documents and ensure that they are meeting the requirements of the procedures involved. So some of them, we may be in good shape already. We collect the document, we're hitting all the marks of the procedure, we put it in there, it's done. We can sort of highlight in green or check off that procedure and it's complete. For some, we may only highlight it in yellow as marginally complete because we have something, but it really is not meeting the full procedure. In that case, then we need to review it with the people involved and ensure going forward that that procedure is in place for it. Now, Deb, I see you have a hand up if you just want to ask the question you had.
Yeah, when you were on the other page, the compliance requirements, page 13 maybe, where you were showing us the section about the documentation, and there was the very first line talked about, can you go back to that?
Yeah, was that earlier on? I apologize.
Before this, the screen before this, I think it's page 13.
With the Wisp, maybe? Let's see. Oh, okay. Yep. Is this the right one, Deborah?
Right here. So under procedure control activities, wait, you just changed the screen again. No, go back to the other one you were just on. No, the procedure control activities that you just were on.
For asset inventories or for something else?
It was before you got to asset inventories. You went to asset inventories from there. You just were on the page.
Yeah, this is where we were before, Deb, when we were talking about.
No. Here, stop.
Okay.
So do you see about halfway down the page, procedure control activities, and number 1 says analyzes all applicable statutory, wait, I just lost it again.
Okay, I think you're a little bit behind my machine. That's probably why.
I'm sorry.
Okay, here it is. It's highlighted in orange. Yep.
I have to wait for the screen to change because there it is. Okay, the number 1 analyzes all applicable statutory, regulatory, and contractual obligations to create a list of requirements that need to be addressed by ET's policies and standards. The list, the contractual obligations, is that cybersecurity contract? What contractual obligations are those we're talking about?
Okay, so if we go back to this section here, so it'll take a second to refresh on your screen. But we look at known compliance requirements. And it is interesting. The screen share is significantly behind. I'm looking at it at another device here, but wow, it's really behind. I apologize. That's probably throwing everyone off.
That's okay.
But I'll stop and reshare it. Just give me a moment here. Try this if it works a little better. Of course, it's going to be blurry. Stop it one more time. Okay, so now we're on the right page. So this section, which is sort of a global section at the top of the document, it's something we mentioned will ultimately need to be updated and filled out for each person or for each site. Some of this is universal. So for instance, statutory requirements for a school district are going to be fairly universal for everybody. Regulatory requirements are going to be fairly universal for everyone. So as we start to fill this out, we can share it among the group and it will be pretty much the same for everybody. What might change is contractual requirements, which would apply to things like contracts you have with your teaching staff. What we don't know, and this is where it goes back to that executive management team, which may involve legal counsel for the district, is, more and more entities that maintain contracts with the district, often you think of contracts with your vendors, but you also have two-way contracts with groups like your teachers union. They may have contractual requirements now that we don't even know about because we're not part of those conversations that touch on cybersecurity and data protection. So it's something that we'll just need to consider and ask about and ensure that we're meeting those requirements. So for instance, it may be that the teachers union, I use them as one example, that they maintain a contract that stipulates that certain personal and private information must be held in a certain way by the district. So that's why, this will ultimately need to get filled in with some of those. I don't think there will be much for school districts, but there may be some items that will need to be reviewed. And that's why this section on cybersecurity governance will ultimately need to be reviewed with what we call, or the document refers to as, kind of the executive cyber leadership. And that's going to include the superintendent, and again, may even include legal counsel to ensure that we're not missing any requirements that exist in contracts that the district maintains.
So if we have like 6 unions, we have to look at all 6 different contracts.
It may be that there's items. Now, that's where it might be easier to ask, and these are components that might get offloaded, and say to legal counsel or whoever maintains those contracts, please make us aware if there are any cybersecurity/data protection requirements outlined in these contracts, because we need to address it in our documentation. Does that clear that up, Deba?
Yeah, thanks. I just...
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for the delay. Every so often, Zoom has a little delay in the screen share, so hopefully that wasn't throwing everybody off too much.
We all know about it from our teachers.
Well, now you know what happens to even the best of us. Okay, so we were looking at asset management as an example of an area or a procedure that's going to involve other documents. What I'll do is see if there's a trick to refreshing this here. Some of this we mentioned we will have to collect. It may exist. Some places have great inventory. Some places the inventories are a disaster. Point is getting everybody up to the same place with how we perform those inventories, whether we're using an external tool, whether the insurance company maintains those inventories as they do in some cases, whatever it is, we need to know that we're collecting everything that this requires in the procedure and that we have it all in the necessary place. Our recommendation, and as part of the homework, is going to be outlining, some of these items that we need to collect. And we've already gone through and created sort of a spreadsheet that we'll share of some of these secondary documents that we'll need to compile into this whole master program that we're putting together. Assets are kind of an easy one to understand. But just while we look at the asset management piece, you'll notice some of that same language that we mentioned before, points where it says things like, again, moments in time throughout the year are referenced. This is where decisions will have to be made. If we leave this generic like this, well, it's incomplete. We're going to have to decide in the case of each site, when we do this. Again, we're going to try to pull out of this document a full spreadsheet of all of these sections where we have to dictate a moment in time and decide whether or not something happens annually, monthly, daily, whatever it is, to ensure that we at least update those sections of the document. That will lighten the load a little bit when it comes to making sure that we get to each point and make decisions where decisions need to be made. Some of this document is really just updating it to reflect what we're doing. Some of it is we need to make decisions about when and how we want to do something. So we want to simplify that as much as possible. So in the near future, we'll have a separate spreadsheet that outlines anything time related and anything that would need to go on a calendar so that we can say it's being accomplished. Along those lines, I'm going to jump to the next section after we get out of assets, and that is our business continuity and disaster recovery section of the document. This is another section where it references other documents. So just to be clear, the procedures here outline some of what happens in order to provide contingencies, in order to have a recovery plan and things like that. But this section does not serve as the business continuity and disaster recovery plan. That is a secondary or tertiary document that gets associated with this. Many places already have that in some form or fashion. Again, that's going to be something as part of the homework to go get, to bring in, and at least put in the same folder or area as these documents so that we can associate it with it. We then will go into each of those and ensure that they are including, or that they include all of the information that the procedure here outlines that it needs to include. So what I'm going to do is jump over here to our presentation and just bring you to that page. Let's see. Go back a step. So this is a kind of rough outline, and we'll share an actual spreadsheet of this with everybody. Outline of other documents that will be necessary for us to collect or create or put together with these two documents that we've already reviewed a little bit in order to have a full digital security program. So this first title here, Digital Security Program, that's sort of the overarching package that we're all putting together. It includes the Wisp document that's very simple and doesn't require much in the way of customization. In fact, we can pretty much just review it and adopt it. It includes this CSOP procedurals document, which does require a measure of customization, which we're going to be working on. But then there are all of these other components that will ultimately need to be included with it. Some of them, though, are sort of grouped together. So you'll see what we have listed here is for each of these, something like asset management. These different components that are listed throughout the CSOP document really are one item. It's your inventory and your network diagrams, and then a one page about what we do to remove items on an annual basis or a more frequent basis. So that much of that already exists. Our IT teams can collect the network diagrams if they need to be updated. It will not take much to get that knocked out. When it comes to the inventories, we'll take whatever we have and at least compile it somewhere so we at least have the first step when it comes to those inventories. So this one's not so overwhelming, but it will maybe affect how we do inventories going forward. This other one, our business continuity and disaster recovery plan, this is a larger document of which many of us updated a number of years ago, and we may have up-to-date ones, and it may be ones that we're already working on. But we're going to want to sit down and really review those and ensure that they're meeting the requirements of the procedures in this CSOP document. You'll notice, though, that one plan covers quite a bit. They all go together. That's one document. So by really focusing on that document, which we're going to put as a priority regardless, just because it's something we want, both in practice and because of this, that document will knock out a lot of the workload necessary to complete this procedural document. Another one is our incident response plan. We'll just clear the you'll notice the stuff in green. That's the incident response plan. That itself is another important document. So what we're going to ultimately focus on in the coming, maybe next 2 months, is really the incident response plan and the disaster recovery business continuity plan, because those two secondary documents both will knock out much of the work needed to finish this CSOP document, but they also are probably the most mission critical to protecting our districts. We know based on experiences with cybersecurity issues, whether it's ransomware attacks, whether it's physical damage to equipment, those are some of our most important documents to have. And it's an area where we're starting to make adjustments. Just so everyone knows, with the most recent events that we had take place in two of our districts, it brought to our attention new ways to address things like how we perform backups and recoveries. For as much as we had backups of everything, lessons learned regarding the best way to recover so that it's more efficient. We're more efficient in bringing systems online, or other ways we could back things up differently so that we can bring certain aspects of a network up first in order to bring business online faster. So those are definitely two components that go hand in hand, because often you're pulling out your continuity plan because of an incident. So they often go hand in hand. Those are two big pieces that we're going to want to focus on over the course of the next, 2 to 3 months to make sure those are all brought up to speed, everybody's on the same page, and ensure that they meet the procedural requirements of the NIST framework. Just while we're here, two of the other pieces, as I moved away by accident, this risk management program piece and the vulnerability and patch management program, those are also other documents that will ultimately need to be compiled into this. The reason why I didn't highlight them now is because for vulnerability and patch management, it would really be something we put together after we've taken care of these other two pieces. It's also something that will likely take less to put together. But we want to have these other two pieces done first. The risk management program, that's a piece where it may involve using outside entities. I know some sites have already talked to companies like Blue Orange and others about assisting with compliance coaching and risk assessments. So it may be that that's covered already under some of those services that are provided. Where maybe those entities are actually performing the risk assessment on an annual basis. So it may not be necessary for us to develop a whole program since we're already getting it from an entity like that. On the other hand, if it's a site that's not going to pursue any of those services, then that's another program or set of documents that we'll need to compile. And we have some avenues for that we can pursue in order to round out that piece of the program. So as I mentioned, I wanted to move somewhat quickly through this so that we weren't overwhelming today. And I know everybody has so many meetings back to back to back. And our goal is to get into a mode now of meeting on a monthly basis. Hopefully this kind of middle of the month date worked well for everyone. And so I plan on sending out an invite for a date just before the holidays in hopes that we could meet in December. But I want to just take a moment to go over a little bit of what we're designating as homework. And this is homework for the whole IT department. So, obviously most of the folks that are on with us today are, sites that utilize EduTech services. So this involves our staff too. And so they're aware of it. The operations managers assigned to your sites are aware of it. The first item on this list is that whole idea of reviewing this documentation with your entire team. And don't mind my associate named Trixie, the golden doodle, who's barking in the background. Reviewing the document is a meeting that you should be scheduling with your team, maybe right after Thanksgiving. Don't wait to do it. Plan on printing out copies of it or sending it out digitally to everyone, and just sit and review the document together so that the entire IT team is aware of what's involved and the policies that we ultimately have to live up to. It's important to make this a formal meeting. We get one out of the way, and then that's something that you're doing at least annually. Have sign-in sheet, make sure it's recorded, and that was a formal event that took place, because we want to be able to demonstrate that down the road, that this is something that we're reviewing and is adopted by the whole team on at least an annual basis. That's probably the easiest step in this whole process. The second thing is reviewing that CSOP document. So this doesn't necessarily have to be the whole team, but at least key stakeholders that are going to be involved. So this might be your operations manager, maybe your lead engineer, as well as anyone that's going to be involved in helping to compile this documentation. Look at that overview, instructions, and example section of the document. That was, just so you recall, at the very beginning of our document, there was a section that referred to overview, instructions, and examples. See if I can get over there. This is something you want to review with that team so that everyone has a clear understanding of how this document is formulated, how it's written, the type of language used, so that you're all on the same page when it comes to how you're going to update it and edit it. Also goes into some of the guidance on how to customize it. So it's going to be important for everyone to be on the same page in regards to this. I'm just going to share it again just so it gets caught up a little bit for you. A second here. There we go. Another piece of this is going to be this section here that needs to be updated. Let me just jump down to it. Which is the cybersecurity, privacy, and function overview, which is really the first section that needs to be updated for each site. Just make sure the screen share gets there so everybody can see it. Okay, here we go. So this is where you're going to at least draft the team, put the names in, a rough outline of their titles, things like that, but at least list the people here. Come up with a basic mission statement. Maybe it changes over time, but let's just fill something in there so that that section is done. And then the value proposition section as well, down at the bottom, get that filled out as well. These should not take long. It does not have to be, I would not spend 3 months coming up with a mission statement. Keep it as simple as possible, but have just something there. Same thing with the value proposition. Then on the next page, start to fill this out with what you know, because this is a section where hopefully we all can share our notes on and make sure that none of us are missing anything across our sites. So start to fill this in. We realize that we may need external help with this, whether it's administration or legal counsel, but there are certain things we know need to be here. So start filling this section in. So as we go back to our homework here, that's this cybersecurity and privacy function overview. That whole section is what we want everybody to really review and start to fill out. Because again, that section should not take more than, an hour maybe of you and your couple of IT team people. Come up with a mission statement. If it has to change, it changes, but just getting something down on the paper so that we can finalize that piece of it. Okay. Now I did notice one, I think Janice, you had mentioned you didn't see that section in your document. If you don't, if I need to resend some of the documentation, if you're missing anything that we've discussed today, I can just shoot me an email and I'll resend you updated copies if you need it.
Matt, we don't have it either.
No, okay. All right, I'll make sure that gets sent to everyone. I'll look at it and make sure if there's a reason why that wasn't on that sheet, but I'll make sure that's part of it.
Okay, thank you.
Now, as we go further down, there's another section that whether or not you're able to get to it, we know everybody's busy, but if it's possible to start it, the other sections that are sort of the low-hanging fruit for us to update in order to get this document, closer to being finished, are some of the appendices at the end. So Appendix B and C are sections that should not take long to at least draft. So let me go over to those just so you see what those are. I have a secondary machine here that I'm watching to make sure that it updates the screen. But yeah, it is definitely laggy. Okay, so Appendix B is available tools and services. This is a section that your network admin can fill out for you. And it's basically any systems that we have that we just want to list out, almost an inventory of tools that we're using. So things like our antivirus, or if we're using, whatever our backup solution is, just list it out here. As much of what we can get put here should get listed. It's really just an inventory of some of those tools and systems that we use in order to fulfill our full program. So things like what backup system we use, things like if we're using secondary disaster recovery systems, like in some cases we're using the Lyric for, backing up Finance Manager as a secondary backup. Maybe we're using Granite Technologies as our InVision DR site. Some of those things, we just want to get them listed here. And it's sort of just an inventory of some of those components. So that's a fairly easy one to fill out. The other one is this section referring to key stakeholders. And this might take a little more time, but it's still, again, something that could easily be, you can run through quickly and make a draft of, because a lot of the people are going to be the same for each of these. So as we look at most of these, it's likely going to be either the director of technology for the district, or it's going to be your lead technician, or even your operations manager, whose name is going to be here, is really the key individual that's associated with these systems. So again, this is not a terribly difficult section to fill out. And it might be something you can even do collectively with the team the day that you meet to review the Wisp. I noticed some say they don't have that appendix as well. So I'm going to make sure, I'll look at the documents that you guys have and make sure that everybody has these sections and see why they might be missing in some cases. So these, just so you know, once I get you clarified documents, because it seems like a few are missing it. These would be the sections we're going to want everyone to review and hopefully update as much of as possible before we meet next, because our goal for the next meeting is to really dig into some of those other documents, like our business continuity and recovery plan, as well as the incident response plan, because those are going to take probably the most amount of time to really formulate and customize for each site. So if we at least get some of this, we'll call it almost clerical components done, then it will make that piece a lot easier. Darlene, I think you have a question.
Yes, just wanted to check with you, Matt. You mentioned a lot of the generic information that would be applicable to all of us. Since you're talking about resending some of the documentation, is there any way that you could enter that type of information ahead of time and then send it to us? I think that would be helpful if that was at all possible.
You know what, it was that one section primarily on kind of regulatory compliance, which we have not filled out yet. And the thought was maybe as we all collectively do it, we can share. So I don't necessarily have that information yet. The other things that are going to be similar across the sites really have to do with the spreadsheets that we're formulating for everyone that outline some of the dates that are required to fill some of these things, and the calendar events that need to take place. That we're definitely going to share with everyone. But that one regulatory component, once we know we have a set, section for everybody, we can share it. But we're definitely need to work with everybody a little bit to ensure we're not missing anything. So Darlene, I hope that answers the question. I apologize. Not so much that's identical, but.
Right. Well, anything that would be generic, would be helpful for us to go through and try to figure this all out. Yes, thank you.
And I think as we find other aspects of it that we can share, as we develop it, we can definitely, share among the group. I don't think anyone's opposed to that. We're really not talking about proprietary information, in this case. The cybersecurity framework is well documented on the internet. For as much as you want to keep as much of this private, for the sake of security, we're adopting a national framework that everyone knows about. So there's much that we can share, and there's value to sharing it.
Okay, thank you.
So based on the feedback that I got, I'm going to go through the documents that everyone has. If anyone is wondering what are these documents that we're talking about, please send me an email or reach out to your OM so that we can get you information on it. I will make sure I know why those sections aren't there, or if it may be that the documents you have are a little newer than mine. So I just got to go and look at a couple of them to compare and see if maybe it was put in a different section. to make sure we're all looking at the same thing. And that's pretty much everything we wanted to at least cover for today. Like I said, I didn't want to take too much time. I know everyone has back-to-back Zoom meetings. We did record this. We'll post it so that if you want to go back to something, and we'll do that with the subsequent meetings. If at all possible, please, between now and I will try to shoot out a meeting request for before the holiday break in December. But between now and then, if you could at least meet with your team and review the Wisp document, since that really doesn't require any customization, you can review it and check that off the list. Start, if you can, getting into this other document with your team as much as possible. If there's any of the clerical components that you can start to fill out, that's ideal. Between now and then, we'll have the IT team start collecting as much old documentation that we may have on things like your business continuity plans, your disaster recovery plans, inventories, things like that. We'll start in the background just trying to collect whatever we have. Network diagrams, getting those things done so that we can get some of that clerical work accomplished as well. And at least be able to sit down next month and say, okay, this is what I have. Let's start looking at what we need and then make a list of changes that we can start with. So hopefully that helps us to make some progress. At the same time, we're going to have our staff members, we're giving them copies of these documents so that they can be reviewing it on their own, so that they're also familiar with it, so that when you do sit down with them, you're not starting from scratch. So hopefully that will be helpful as well. Any other questions while we're before we break from here?
Matt, if we didn't actually get the documents, where do we get those from, or how do we find them?
Jay, I will check because I thought Irvington had done it. I sent out links during the summer, but I know for a lot of people, they kind of got lost in the mix of the craziness. So I will make sure that I get those sent over to you. I'll send you a link.
Great. Yeah, because I'm looking. I couldn't find it by looking up.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, great.
I'll make sure you get that.
Thanks.
No problem. Any other questions before we break out for today? All right. Very good. Thank you, everybody, for setting aside a little time. We're happy to get back to this, and we want to make it a little more routine. So I'll send out those calendar invites in the next day or so, just so that hopefully it's far enough in advance to grab as many as possible. I'll try to keep these to an hour so it's not overwhelming. And if we have to do individual meetings in between, I'm happy to do that too, so that everyone can be making progress on it. But thank you very much for the time today, and have a great afternoon, everyone.